they said she would die poor. In the narrow streets of her village, whispers always found their way into young Amina's ears. Her father had been a struggling farmer, his hands calloused from years of tilling dry, cracked soil that yielded little more than enough to keep his family alive. Her mother sold akra by the roadside, frying bean cakes in oil that often sputtered and burned her arms, but the customers came because her smile softened the harshness of the day. Amina, their first daughter, was the one who carried baskets of bean cakes on her head to the market square, weaving her way through the chaos of shouting traders, honking taxis, and goats running across dusty roads. She remembered every word of the neighbors who sat under the neem tree in the evenings, gossiping in loud tones as if the harmattan winds carried their words to the ears of the gods. That girl? She is wasting her time. She will die poor like her parents. A girl with big dreams but no shoes on her feet. Dreams don't fill the stomach. They laughed, sipping millet beer from calabashes, their laughter sharp, cutting into her spirit like a knife. At times she wanted to scream, to shout back that she was more than what they saw, but her mother always touched her arm gently and whispered, "Amina, the goat that bleats too much does not grow fat. Let your silence and your work be your answer." Yet silence did not still her heart. Amina was restless. She would sit outside at night under the dim glow of the kerosene lamp, watching the sky fill with stars and imagining herself walking into big cities where tall buildings kissed the clouds, where women wore fine suits, drove cars, and carried briefcases instead of firewood. She dreamed of Lagos, of Accra, of Nairobi, places that sounded like faraway kingdoms and stories. But in her reality, her school uniform was faded and her sandals had been repaired with wires more times than she could count. Her teachers often told her she was intelligent, but intelligence in a place where poverty strangled opportunity was like rain that fell into a basket, wasted, dripping through the cracks. Still she persevered. Every morning, she rose before dawn, helped her mother grind beans, fetched water from the borehole, then hurried to school, balancing her books and the weight of expectations she didn't yet know how to fulfill. She was always the first to arrive in class, sitting on the front bench, her eyes shining with hunger, not for food, but for knowledge. She wanted to know how the world worked, how people built companies, how money moved, how ideas could turn into empires. But in her small village, the only empires she saw were the sprawling compounds of politicians who rarely visited except during elections. By the time she was 16, tragedy struck. Her father fell ill. It started as a cough, then a fever, then his body wasted away. The local clinic demanded money for proper treatment, money they did not have. Amina sold everything she owned, her few dresses, her mother's jewelry, even the goat her father had given her as a childhood gift. But it was not enough. She watched him take his last breath on a hot afternoon, his eyes glassy, his hand clutching hers as though he still believed she could save him. Her mother wailed in the traditional way women of the village did, rolling in the dust, her voice rising like a song of despair. Amina stood frozen, her heart breaking but her face stoic, because deep down, she knew this was not the end of suffering. It was just the beginning. Her father's burial was simple, wrapped in white cloth and lowered into the earth. The neighbors came, offering condolences laced with the same pity they had always reserved for the poor. One woman whispered loudly enough for Amina to hear, "Iya, now they will suffer even more. That girl? She will soon drop out of school. Poverty will finish her." Amina clenched her jaw, swallowing her rage, but inside her spirit burned like coal. That day, she promised herself that one day, these same people would look at her not with pity, but with awe. But life did not give her much time to grieve. Her mother, overwhelmed by the weight of survival, grew weaker each day. The small Accra business barely covered their food, and Amina had to start trading in the market after school, buying and reselling fruits, carrying heavy baskets on her head, bargaining with men who laughed at her boldness. Sometimes she went hungry, sometimes she slept on an empty stomach, but she kept going. Her teachers noticed her struggle in one. An elderly man named Mr. Okoro pulled her aside one evening. "Amina," he said, "your mind is sharp, sharper than many I've seen. Don't let this village bury your dreams. If you get the chance, run with it." But what chance? Where would it come from? Opportunities didn't fall from the sky, like mangoes. They had to be grabbed, fought for, sometimes stolen. She prayed every night, asking God to open a door. And one day he did, but in the most unexpected way. Amina had gone to market as usual, her basket filled with tomatoes. A man in a well-ironed shirt, speaking with a city accent, stopped by. He looked at her, surprised by her fluent English as she explained the prices. "You speak well," he said. "What school do you attend?" She told him. He asked about her grades. She told him she was the best in her class. The man smiled. "You remind me of my younger sister. There's a scholarship program in the city for brilliant students from rural areas. You should apply." Those words were like music. Amina begged him for details, and he scribbled an address on a piece of paper. That night, under the flickering lamp, she stared at the paper as though it were a golden ticket. The next week, she traveled by rickety bus to the city office, clutching the paper as if it were her lifeline. She walked into the tall building, intimidated by the glass doors and the air conditioning that kissed her skin. People looked at her dusty shoes, her simple dress, but she kept her head high. She filled out the forms, wrote an essay about her dreams, and prayed. Weeks later, when the letter arrived, her hands trembled as she opened it. She had won the scholarship. She screamed, laughed, cried, hugged her mother all at once. Her mother wept, her tears falling into Amina's hair. "My daughter, God has answered." The neighbors shook their heads, some pretending to be happy, others muttering, "We will see how far she goes. These things don't last." But it lasted. Amina moved to the city, stepping into a new world that felt both terrifying and exciting. She lived in a small hostel, ate cheap meals, but for the first time in her life, she saw possibilities. She met people from wealthy families, children who complained about things she considered luxuries. They laughed at her accent, at her clothes, but she ignored them. She studied harder than everyone else, spending nights in the library, her eyes heavy but her heart alive with ambition. She wasn't just learning for herself. She was learning for her late father, for her struggling mother, for every girl in her village who was told she would never amount to anything. Still, the city was not kind. She faced discrimination, exploitation, betrayal. One of her closest friends in school, a girl from a rich family named Sandra, once promised to help her secure an internship. Amina trusted her, shared her plans, only to discover later that Sandra had stolen her ideas and presented them as her own to her uncle, a businessman. Amina was devastated, but she refused to bow to betrayal. She told herself, "If they can steal from me, it means I have something valuable. And if I have something valuable, I can build more." And so she began. She started a small side hustle, selling secondhand clothes she bought from the market and resold to students. Her sharp negotiation skills, learned from years of bargaining in the village market, gave her an advantage. Soon, she was making enough to send a little money back home. Her mother, though frail, was proud. But life struck again. One morning, a phone call came. Her mother had collapsed. By the time she rushed back to the village, her mother was gone. Amina wept like a child, her body shaking, her cries echoing through the night. She felt orphaned, alone, betrayed by life itself. The neighbors shook their heads, whispering, "Now she is finished. Without parents, how will she survive?" But Amina, through her tears, made another vow. "I will not die poor. I will not let their words be true." Her journey had only just begun. After burying her mother beside her father in the red soil of the village, Amina stood at the graveside with dust clinging to her feet and sorrow sitting heavily on her chest. The mourners had gone, leaving only the sound of crickets and the distant bleating of goats. She was alone now, truly alone, with no father to guide her and no mother to comfort her. But even as tears blurred her vision, something inside her shifted. Pain turned into fire. If life had stripped her bare, then she would rebuild herself stronger, richer, untouchable. When she returned to the city, her spirit carried a new weight. She threw herself into her studies like a warrior preparing for battle. Every class was an opportunity, every book a weapon, every lecture a chance to sharpen her mind. While others partied, Amina worked. While others wasted money on fancy clothes, she reinvested her little profits from selling secondhand clothes into buying more stock. She became known in the hostel as Market Queen because she always had something to sell: bags, shoes, fabrics. At first, some mocked her, but when they began to admire her style and her growing business, the laughter turned into envy. Still, challenges lined her path. She had no one to fall back on when things went wrong. Once, a trader duped her, disappearing with all her savings meant for a bulk order. She sat on the floor of her tiny hostel room that night, shaking, her hands on her head, her chest aching from grief. "Why is life always against me?" she whispered into the darkness. But then, she remembered her father's words before he died. "My daughter, life will test you like fire tests gold. If you survive, you'll shine." She wiped her tears and swore to herself she would not give up. Her resilience caught the attention of people around her. One day, after a heated class debate, a lecturer called her aside. Professor Adewale was a well-respected man, known for mentoring students. "Amina," he said, adjusting his glasses, "you have something many of your classmates don't. You have hunger. Not hunger for food, but hunger for success. If you can focus that hunger, you will go far." He later introduced her to a networking event in the city, her very first exposure to a world she had only dreamed of. That night, she entered a conference hall filled with bright lights, polished floors, and men in suits that seemed to shine with money. She felt small, wearing her simple dress and borrowed shoes. But she listened carefully, soaking up every word. Entrepreneurs spoke about business, investment, and building wealth. Her heart pounded. This was a world she wanted. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough. Knowledge and connections were power. She started attending more events, sometimes sneaking in because she couldn't afford the entry fees. She stood at the back, notebook in hand, writing furiously. Slowly, she learned the language of business. Terms like equity, capital, scaling. While other students were memorizing theories just to pass exams, Amina was studying the real world, planning for the future. But the city was full of wolves. At one event, a wealthy businessman approached her after she asked a sharp question during the Q&A. "You're smart," he said, his smile dripping with charm. "I can help you if you help me." She understood his meaning. He wanted her body in exchange for opportunities. The insult burned her. She looked him in the eyes and said, "If you think my only value is what you see on the outside, you're blind. My mind will build more than your money ever could." She walked away, her legs shaking but her pride intact. That night, she cried, not because of his insult, but because she realized the world would always try to test her dignity. She decided she would succeed on her own terms, or not at all. By the time she graduated, Amina was already known as a hustler who could sell anything. She had saved enough to rent a tiny kiosk near the university gate, where she sold clothes and accessories. It wasn't much, but it was hers. When others went job hunting, submitting CVs to companies that never replied, she focused on her kiosk. She told herself, "If I can sell here, I can sell anywhere. If I can build here, I can build bigger." Her first big break came by accident. A corporate lady walked into her kiosk one afternoon, looking for a scarf. Impressed by Amina's confidence and persuasive energy, she bought more than she planned. "You should consider supplying offices," the woman said. "We are always looking for vendors for uniforms, corporate gifts, things like that." The word struck Amina like lightning. That night, she couldn't sleep. Supplying offices? She had never thought that far. But the idea stuck, and she began researching, asking questions, learning about tenders and supply contracts. At first, it was frustrating. She knocked on doors, only to be ignored or dismissed because she was young and female. Some laughed at her proposals, but she kept pushing. She wore her one decent suit, carried her cheap briefcase, and walked into offices with the confidence of a queen. Most said no, but one said yes. A small law firm agreed to let her supply office stationery. It was a tiny contract, barely enough to cover her transport, but it was a start. Amina treated it like it was worth millions. She delivered on time, with quality, with a smile. Soon, the law firm recommended her to another and then another. Her network grew slowly, painfully, but steadily. Each small contract led to a bigger one. She learned to reinvest every profit, never spending foolishly. While her peers were buying new phones, she was buying stock. While others rented fancy apartments, she remained in her small room, saving for the future. People whispered again, this time in the city, that girl? She is different. She is going somewhere. But not everyone was happy. Some of her fellow traders grew jealous, spreading rumors that she was being sponsored by a sugar daddy. Others tried to sabotage her by undercutting prices or delivering false stories about her reliability. Once, a competitor deliberately misinformed her about a delivery date, causing her to nearly lose a contract. She cried bitterly that night, but when dawn came, she wiped her face and doubled her efforts. She began keeping strict records, building trust with her clients. Slowly, her reputation for honesty and hard work became her shield against lies. Still, loneliness haunted her. In the silence of her small apartment, after long days of hustling, she missed her parents deeply. Sometimes she wished her father could see her carrying a briefcase instead of firewood. Sometimes she longed for her mother's warm embrace after a hard day. Love, too, seemed far away. Men approached her, but many saw her only as a conquest or convenience. Some said she was too ambitious for a woman, that no man would marry her. Their words cut deep as she told herself, if love comes, it will come, but my destiny cannot wait. One evening, after closing her kiosk, she sat at the bus stop, exhausted. An elderly woman selling roasted corn beside her struck up a conversation. My daughter, the woman said, you walk like someone carrying the world. Amina smiled weakly. The woman continued, don't let the world break you. Even iron bends, but the tree that bends with the wind stands longer. Those words stayed with Amina, reminding her that strength was not just about fighting, but also about enduring. Years passed, and her business grew. From one kiosk, she expanded into 3. From small supply contracts, she secured medium ones. She registered her company officially, gave it a name that carried her dream, Ashanti Enterprises. She hired 2 staff members, young girls from poor backgrounds like hers, determined to give them the chances she never had. She became not just a businesswoman, but a leader. But success brought new challenges. Larger companies, threatened by her rising profile, began blocking her from contracts. Corrupt officials demanded bribes. Once, when she refused to pay, her paperwork mysteriously disappeared from a government office. Rage boiled in her, but she remembered her promise to succeed with dignity. She found ways around, networking with honest officials, leveraging referrals, and slowly building a reputation that even corruption could not destroy. Her first true turning point came when she won a major contract to supply uniforms for a multinational company. It was her biggest deal yet, worth more money than she had ever seen. But it came with risks. If she failed, she would be ruined. She spent sleepless nights planning, calculating, praying. When delivery day came, she arrived with everything in perfect order. The company executives were impressed, and soon they offered her more contracts. That was the beginning of her rise from a small trader to a recognized entrepreneur. But with growth came betrayal. One of her trusted staff, whom she had treated like a younger sister, stole money from her accounts. The discovery broke her heart. She felt used, deceived, as though kindness was weakness. She confronted the girl, who cried and begged, saying poverty pushed her. Amina, though furious, saw herself in that desperation. Instead of sending her to jail, she dismissed her quietly, but the pain lingered. That night, she wept, not because of the money lost, but because betrayal hurt more than hunger ever did. Yet she kept going, because her dream was bigger than her pain. The day Amina signed her first multi-million contract, she felt her knees go weak. It wasn't just the money, it was the weight of a promise fulfilled. She had vowed to her father's grave that she would not die poor, and now the girl who once sold bean cakes on dusty streets was negotiating with CEOs in glass towers. Still, she knew this was not the end. It was only a stepping stone. She wanted more, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been told their lives would end in poverty. Her company, Ashan Enterprises, began to grow beyond what anyone expected. She diversified, importing fabrics, supplying building materials, even venturing into logistics. Each move was calculated, never reckless. Amina had learned from pain that every naira, every sadi, every shilling mattered. Her offices expanded from a single room to a whole building. She hired more staff, not just because she needed them, but because she believed in lifting others. Many of her employees were young women who had once been street hawkers or school dropouts. She trained them, mentored them, and gave them dignity. But as her business grew, so did the enemies. The corporate world was not a place of faint-hearted, especially not for a young African woman. Men who saw her as competition began to spread rumors, calling her arrogant, saying her success was due to sleeping with powerful men. At first, those words cut deep, but Amina soon learned that silence was her greatest weapon. She let her results speak for her. When competitors tried to crush her, she responded with excellence. When they mocked her, she outperformed them. Slowly, their laughter turned into grudging respect. Yet the higher she climbed, the lonelier it became. She moved into a better apartment, then eventually into a gated estate. But the silence of her new home often reminded her of her mother's cooking, her father's stories, and the laughter of neighbors under the neem tree. Sometimes, as she sat at her glass desk late into the night, she would whisper to herself, "Is this the price of success? To win the world, but lose the warmth of belonging." Still, she knew she could not go back. The only way was forward. Love entered her life unexpectedly. At a business conference in Nairobi, she met Michael, a Kenyan entrepreneur. He was unlike the men she was used to. He didn't try to belittle her ambition, nor did he flatter her with empty words. Instead, he listened, asked questions, and challenged her ideas. They began talking, first about business, then about life. He understood her struggles because he too had started from nothing, selling newspapers on the streets of Mombasa before building his logistics company. For the first time, Amina felt seen, not as a trophy, not as a threat, but as a partner. Their friendship blossomed into romance, but it wasn't easy. Some of Michael's friends warned him, "Be careful. That woman is too powerful. She will never respect you." Others told Amina, "A successful woman cannot have love. Men will always be intimidated." They both faced skepticism, but their bond grew stronger. Together, they dreamed of building not just businesses, but legacies across Africa. Amina, who once thought love would slow her down, now found strength in companionship. But success is never without storms. A year after meeting Michael, Amina faced her greatest challenge yet. A powerful conglomerate, threatened by her growing influence, launched a campaign to destroy her company. They bribed officials to cancel her contracts, spread false stories in the media about her fraudulent dealings, and pressured banks to withdraw support. Overnight, her reputation was dragged through the mud. Clients began to distance themselves. Employees panicked, some resigning out of fear. It felt as though the empire she had built with sweat and sacrifice was crumbling before her eyes. Amina fought back. She held press conferences, presenting evidence of her clean records. She met with clients one by one, pleading for trust. Some stood by her, but others turned away, not wanting to risk their own names. Her office, once buzzing with energy, grew quiet. Bills piled up. For the first time in years, she felt the cold hands of poverty creeping near again. One night, she sat on the floor of her office, staring at the ceiling, whispering, "God, did you bring me this far to abandon me?" Michael urged her not to give up. This is war, Amina, and wars are not won by running. You have to fight smarter. He introduced her to allies, journalists who exposed the corruption of her rivals, lawyers who defended her contracts, and investors who believed in her vision. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The conglomerate's lies were uncovered, and public sympathy shifted toward Amina. The same newspapers that once called her a fraud now hailed her as a fighter, a symbol of resilience. But victory came at a price. Some of her closest allies betrayed her, secretly cutting deals with her rivals. It hurt more than losing money. Betrayal always cut deeper than poverty. Yet Amina refused to let bitterness consume her. She learned to guard her trust, to build walls where once she had built bridges. She grew tougher, sharper, and wiser. When she finally stabilized her company, she made a bold decision. She would no longer play only in one corner of Africa. If enemies wanted to bury her, then she would grow roots across the continent, too deep and wide for anyone to uproot. She expanded Ashani Enterprises into Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, and Rwanda. She diversified into agriculture, technology, and real estate. Her name began to appear on lists of Africa's top entrepreneurs. Awards followed. Young women wrote her letters, calling her their role model. Governments invited her to speak about women in business. She, the village girl once mocked for being barefoot, was now walking on stages where presidents listened. Still, she never forgot her village. One day, she returned years after her mother's death. She wore a simple dress, her convoy of cars stopping at the same dusty road where she once carried bean cakes. The villagers gathered, their mouths wide open, staring at the girl they once mocked. Some fell to their knees, praising her. Others whispered, "Truly, God lifts whom he wishes." Amina built a school in the village, named after her parents. She built a health center so no one else would die like her father. She created jobs so mothers wouldn't have to choose between feeding their children and sending them to school. For her, success wasn't about wealth alone. It was about rewriting the story of her people. But even in victory, scars remained. She remembered every insult, every betrayal. Every night she cried herself to sleep. Those memories fueled her, but they also haunted her. Sometimes, when the cameras were gone and the applause faded, she sat alone in her mansion, asking herself, "Am I truly happy?" Money had given her power, but it had also stolen simplicity. She longed for her mother's laughter, her father's wisdom, the innocence of childhood dreams under the stars. Yet she knew she could not turn back time. All she could do was move forward, using her story as a lantern for others. By her mid-30s, Amina was no longer just a businesswoman. She was a force. She spoke at the African Union, championing policy for women entrepreneurs. She funded scholarships for girls in rural areas. She invested in startups led by young Africans with dreams like hers. And through it all, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had walked through fire and emerged as gold. But power attracts enemies like honey attracts flies. Politicians began approaching her, asking for donations in exchange for favors. She refused, knowing that mixing politics with business was dangerous. This angered some powerful figures. Whispers spread again that she was too proud, too independent. Anonymous threats arrived at her office. Michael worried for her safety. "You need protection," he urged. But Amina shook her head. "If fear controls me, then poverty has won again." She understood now that success wasn't just about building wealth. It was about surviving the storms that wealth attracted. And she was ready, because she had faced storms all her life. The year Amina was named Africa's Businesswoman of the Decade, her face appeared on the covers of international magazines. Cameras followed her wherever she went. Young girls screamed her name like she was a pop star, and presidents rose to shake her hand. For the world, she was a story of triumph, proof that poverty was not destiny. But for Amina, it was still a battle. Every accolade reminded her of the nights she had slept hungry. Every handshake carried echoes of the laughter of villagers who once said she would die poor. Success was no longer just about money or recognition. It was about survival, legacy, and revenge against every whisper that had ever tried to bury her. Her company, Ashani Global Holdings, had grown into a conglomerate spanning logistics, real estate, agriculture, technology, and energy. She employed thousands across Africa, created opportunities for women, and poured money into education and healthcare. Investors called her a visionary. Rivals called her a threat. But even her enemies could not deny her influence. When she spoke, markets listened. When she moved, economies shifted. But the higher she rose, the darker the shadows that followed. One evening, as she sat in her penthouse office overlooking the skyline of Lagos, Michael walked in with a grim expression. He dropped a file on her desk. "You need to see this," he said. Amina opened it and her heart tightened. The conglomerate she had defeated years ago was back, stronger, richer, and angrier. This time, they had formed an alliance with corrupt politicians and foreign investors who saw Amina as an obstacle. Their plan was simple: destroy her empire, piece by piece, until she bowed or broke. For weeks, the attacks came relentlessly. Government agencies suddenly discovered errors in her tax filings. Customs officials delayed her shipments. Anonymous online campaigns painted her as a criminal, calling her the woman who built wealth on blood money. Her partners were pressured to cut ties. Banks froze accounts. It was war again, but on a much bigger battlefield. Amina didn't flinch. She called emergency meetings with her executives, her voice steady even when her chest was burning with fear. We will not bow. We will not beg. We will fight with transparency, with innovation, with resilience. She mobilized her lawyers, her media team, her allies across the continent. She released audited accounts to prove her innocence. She leveraged technology to bypass corrupt supply chains. She gave exclusive interviews, looking straight into the cameras and declaring, "They said I would die poor. They were wrong. And those who say I will fall now are wrong too." Her defiance inspired millions, but behind the strong face was a woman who cried in private, who sometimes clutched her chest at night, whispering to her parents' spirits, "Guide me, protect me." Michael stayed by her side, his presence a pillar, but even he worried about the toll. "Amina," he said one night, holding her hand, "sometimes winning doesn't mean fighting every battle. Sometimes it means choosing peace." She looked at him, her eyes weary but blazing. "Michael, I didn't come this far for peace. I came this far to prove that destiny cannot be dictated by poverty or patriarchy. If I must fight till my last breath, then so be it." Her resistance paid off. Slowly, the truth unraveled. Investigative journalists exposed the corruption of her rivals, linking them to money laundering and shady deals. Public opinion shifted back in her favor. Citizens, especially women, rallied behind her, chanted her name in protests and flooding social media with messages of support. Governments that once bowed to her enemies began to reconsider. Eventually, the alliance against her crumbled, devoured by its own greed and lies. Amina had survived yet another storm, but in victory came a personal tragedy. Michael, her anchor, her partner, her love, died suddenly in a plane crash on his way to Nairobi. The news shattered her. She collapsed when she heard it, her screams piercing the marble halls of her mansion. For days, she refused to eat, refused to see anyone. "Why him?" she cried. "Why always the people I love?" Her empire, her power, her billions, none of it could fill the void his absence left. At his funeral, as she placed flowers on his coffin, she whispered, "You believed in me when the world doubted me. I will carry your dream with mine." For months, she moved like a shadow, functioning but not living. Yet grief did not kill her. It reshaped her. She began to pour even more of herself into her vision. She launched the Michael Foundation for Entrepreneurship, giving young African seed funding and mentorship. She expanded Ashani Global into renewable energy, determined to light up rural villages that still lived in darkness. She invested in healthcare technology, vowing that no father or mother should die from preventable illnesses like hers did. Her pain became her fuel, her revenge against life itself. Years passed, and Amina's legend grew. She became a household name, not just in Africa, but across the world. International leaders consulted her on economic policy. Universities awarded her honorary doctorates. Documentaries told her story. Yet, when she looked in the mirror, she still saw the barefoot girl carrying bean cakes, the girl mocked under the neem tree, the girl crying in her father's grave. Success had not erased her scars. It had only given them a crown. One day, she returned to her village again, this time not just as a successful businesswoman, but as a symbol. She stood in the same market square where she once sold tomatoes, her convoy stretching down the dusty road. The villagers gathered, singing her praises, ululating with joy. Elders who once doubted her now knelt before her, blessing her. Children tugged at her dress, calling her Mama Amina. She built a massive vocational center there, ensuring that no child would be limited by poverty as she had been. Standing before the crowd, she raised her voice. They said I would die poor. They laughed when I dreamed. They mocked when I struggled. But today, I stand before you as proof that poverty is not destiny. We are not defined by where we are born, but by what we choose to become. I did not rise alone. I carry all of you with me. And I promise, as long as I live, no girl in this village, no girl in Africa, will be told she cannot rise. The crowd erupted in cheers, some weeping, some dancing. The sound carried across the fields, across the rivers, into the sky, as though the ancestors themselves were listening. That night, as she sat quietly by her parents' graves, the stars bright above, she whispered, "Mama, Papa, I did it. They said I would die poor, but look at me now." Tears rolled down her face, not of sorrow, but fulfillment. She was no longer just Amina, the girl from the village. She was Amina Ashani, the most powerful businesswoman in Africa, the woman who turned pain into power, betrayal into victory, and poverty into empire. And though her journey had been scarred with loss, betrayal, and heartbreak, her story would live forever, carried on the lips of children yet unborn, a testament that even from dust, gold can rise.